So, welcome to the first Gender to a T of the academic year. I'm Dr. Cheryl Dudasic-Wiggs. I'm the co-director of the Gender Studies program and chair of the Gender Studies Executive Board. Gender to a T is a speaker series designed to help gender-focused researchers by fielding questions from attendees about the presenter's ongoing unpublished research. So we hope you'll ask lots of questions and add to the conversation. I don't think that's going to be a problem with this group. Before we get started, like I said, I want to remind everybody that we're going to be recording today's presentation. We ask that you mute your computers during the presentation itself so that we don't hear your dogs barking or your neighbors talking. So we appreciate that. And I'm pleased to introduce Cierra Buckman, who is with the Brody School of Medicine Pediatrics and is the interim director of the Clinical Trials Office. She's going to be speaking today on gender differences in scholarly activities pre and post-COVID. And so I will turn it over to you. Thanks for coming.
Wonderful. Hi, everyone. And I'll preface all this. I was asking, about format, and I have some slides available, but I'd like this to be more conversational. So I'm happy for everybody to jump in with questions, whether that's unmute yourself or just throw them into the chat. So I'll try to monitor that. As you just heard, my primary focus is in pediatrics. I'm also the interim director of clinical trials for the Brody School of Medicine. And so I've always had this kind of operational lens that I enjoy doing research through as well. And so one of my colleagues is on, Dr. Dimitri Tuman, and we often discuss, different things that we see around the school and then in the broader literature in the field. And so appreciate the context for this project and some of the work related to this really stems from us trying to understand what drives scholarly productivity. And so kind of early on, one of the things that I was worried about is you see all this literature emerging, and maybe now I'll go ahead and share some of the slides. I can't share content, so we'll wait and see if that can be fixed. But so early on, we were kind of discussing, what are the ramifications of this? The literature kind of started to explode, and Cheryl, I don't know if there is a way to get it where I can share slides. Otherwise, I'll send you all this information afterwards. But you saw all this COVID-19 pandemic-related research starting to pop up, right? Like the people who were the first people to get their hands on data and start publishing. And then there were these early reports. So there's one that came out of JAMA, BMJ Open, that were talking about how women had submitted disproportionately fewer manuscripts to peer-reviewed journals, and, they were underrepresented as authors and principal investigators. And so I think that kind of prompted a discussion with Dimitri and I, where we're like, oh, is this going to be an issue? And often ECU feels the effects of, this broader, area, things that are happening in the field. And so we partnered with Allison Flowers out of the Office of Faculty Excellence and Dr. Sama Saeed, who has also done work in this area, to start investigating what this looks like. So historically, just recognize there had been some programs put in place to kind of help research around Brody, both underrepresented in medicine, but also women faculty, achieve scholarly activity. And so we were interested to see, what does this actually look like at ECU? Big factors that you started seeing in the literature, again, trying to set the stage for all this, is, most of the reports went in the direction of women often are the caregivers of their family. So whether that is child care or homeschooling or elderly care, sick family members, women tend to take on those roles. That is like one of those gender differences that you see time and time again. And so would that significantly higher participation in caregiving be more disruptive to their ability to participate in scholarly activities than it would be to men? Thus setting up this argument for a lost generation of early career female investigators. And so, the writing on the wall would be, if you aren't publishing for several years, or if you aren't getting those projects into a pipeline, then that kind of ends up with this cumulative effect. And and maybe now is a good time to stop and pull, but I've even heard some people discuss, you know, taking time off for maternity leave and the impacts that could potentially have to a career, or the idea of women self-selecting into part-time roles so that they can be caregivers, especially if they have children. So I don't know if anybody has a sense or had read any of that literature as well. I'll just pause for a second. Does that sound familiar to everybody from early pandemic conversations?
Yeah.
We're getting yeses.
Yeah. And I just made you able to show your screen. Sorry, I thought I had set that up.
Okay. Yeah, no worries. So I'll show this, and they're not very pretty slides. So please appreciate. Oh, I did the wrong screen. Yeah, share screen too. Okay. So I think with all that, you know, and I'm happy to send anybody the literature that, you know, Dimitri and Allison and Selma and I like that. But, you know, just this risk of lost generation, right? And so when we think about the gendered impact of COVID on scientific careers, one of the biggest differences is that they often looked at that within the broader STEM, right? And we recognize that there's some nuances to being at an academic medical center. So physician or you know, these kind of clinical research scientists, right? Physician scientists, clinical investigators are in a little bit different situation. One, clinical research got much different restrictions during the pandemic just because clinics as a whole had different restrictions, right? Who's allowed in clinic, you know, kind of going down to bare bones services. There's a lot of people I hear who had disrupted primary care and they switched over to telehealth. And so just imagine there was all this research that was happening that suddenly got halted. And then you have these increase in clinical duties, right? Most every physician I know kind of switched over to having these increased workloads because they were covering additional services or the services they had to offer changed. And because of that, physicians were just limited in their ability to do pandemic-related research, right? If your focus is on this clinical care and testing and managing all these patients, there's restrictions on what research you're allowed to do. You might not also have the opportunity to do COVID-related research. And I'll pause. Dimitri, do you feel like there's any background information I'm missing that might help set the stage for some of what we did?
No, thank you for sharing that. I'm excited to see a lot of colleagues from sociology here as well. I think this is a great example of, you know, good multidisciplinary research that you take some of those sociological insights that you mentioned and then really, you know, sees how things panned out during the pandemics. Thank you.
Yeah. So that set the stage for the study that we currently did. So we were looking at gender differences across several measures of scholarly productivity. So, right, most of the research that I've just referenced when we're looking at it often uses maybe one main variable is what I would say. They measure publications, right? Like when you look at scholarly activity, people often default to poster presentations or publications. And one of the ways we wanted to be more innovative was to try and find other ways of measuring scholarly productivity. And what we guessed is that, you know, overall this would hit scholarly publications, right, those peer-reviewed manuscripts, but we also hypothesized that we would see lower rates of institutional review board protocol submissions, right? So just stepping all the way back in this research process, we thought we would see it right there at the front end so that people wouldn't be submitting as many protocols. And then our other guess was that you know, this would impact extramural funding proposals among women more than men, right? That they wouldn't be submitting as many grants. If we were playing out the thought process of gender differences, those would be the three areas that it ends up impacting. Anybody else agree with those, disagree? Do you think that that's the direction this would go? Okay, moving forward. So for methods, we decided to try and look at this using our own academic medical center. So this is a single site study using Brody faculty. So specifically physician faculty, we took anybody who was employed both in a pre-pandemic year, so we took the year of 2019, and then a pandemic year, so 2021. You would have had to have been in a full-time role at Brody throughout that period, right? So this excluded new, faculty that would have come in 2020 or beyond. Faculty who left after 2019 would have been dropped out. People who were only part-time. So again, just trying to think through some of the limitations of this. So if there were female faculty who were only part-time, they would not be captured in this. And so we decided to take that list and examine their scientific publications, their institutional review board protocols, and their funding applications. When we think about this within Brody, which made me really excited, we're small enough that we know where all that information lives, but we're large enough to have a pretty healthy sample, right? So we can use our databases like Scopus and PubMed to find publications. We can use ePirate to pull reports on our IRBs. We can use eTrax to pull reports on our funding submissions. So it was kind of cool to know, hey, these systems are out there, so we can actually get a good snapshot of all this data. And so then Dimitri, being our stats expert, used the mixed effects, I can't even talk, regression model to compare pandemic impact by gender. Any questions about the methods I can answer, or does this seem reasonable? Any critiques on how we're setting up the questions here so far? Okay, so seeing none. So our results, we had 105 women and 116 men. Again, that would be physician faculty employed in both of those years. We came up with 122 publications, 215 protocols, and then 99 extramural funding applications. And when we started controlling for potential confounders, we included faculty rank and track. So we looked at tenure versus non-tenure. And women's publications accounted for or increased by 140% during the pandemic. So totally unexpected. But the rate amongst men remained unchanged during that same period. The number of IRB protocols did increase or decrease from 2019 to 2021, but to a greater extent among men versus among women. So again, not at all what we were expecting. And then there was no gender differences in the number of extramural funding opportunities. One caveat to go back to these methods really quick, we realized eTrax was actually rolled out in 2019, so we didn't get pre-pandemic numbers to compare changes over time. We were only able to look at extramural funding opportunities during 2021. And so with that, we were still absolutely blown away looking at this. And so this is part of where I would like to stop and pause and kind of have a discussion about this. And I'm happy to kind of give you what our thoughts were on it, but just getting some initial reactions, and I already see a hand raised. So please, Melinda, I would love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I wondered, since publications are somewhat of a delayed measure, right, because it takes time for publications to land, that you might actually expect the impact of the pandemic on publication output to happen several years later, that you'd be seeing it now, potentially, rather than more immediate. At least in sociology, it can take quite a while for a manuscript between submission, revise and resubmits, and then acceptance before it's in print. And so I wonder if the fact that that's a more delayed measure, if that could be why you're not seeing the gendered results that you were expecting.
So I agree with you overall. And again, I'd love for this to be a discussion. I think one of the interesting things is we chose 2021 to give that lag time of 2020, right? 2020 is when a lot of things were disrupted, but anything that was ongoing would probably be starting to cross the finish line, right? The 2020 disruption to 2021 publication would be one indicator of projects that are further along. For projects that were starting, that's where you would see those in the IRB kind of submission, right? To your point, it does take a while. So I think that's why we chose to do IRBs, publications, and funding opportunities, because even if you go all the way back to just applying for grants, you know, the fact that we see no difference in the numbers who are applying, and then presumably you might either have your funding or you're moving forward with your study by the time you hit the IRB, and then the delayed effect would be publications. But to your point, I think it's probably worth visiting to see if there is a difference, you know, more in the 2023, 2024. I don't know if you have any reactions. Otherwise, I'd be happy to take another question.
No, that makes sense.
Yeah. Susan Pierce, I see your hand up.
Yes, hi. Thank you. It is interesting because it is different from what we're reading in other studies. I'm curious, first of all, are you disaggregating by age? And, you know, so those that are of, you know, who might have young children at home or are doing elder care, you know, is there a difference there? And then the other thought I had is there something different about being in a medical school where a lot of these people are researching COVID? In other words, if this was an opportunity for people, and that may or may not make any difference in terms of gender, but just curious about that.
Yeah, so I think on the first topic, we were constrained to just doing this with the data HR has available. And so unfortunately, we didn't have a standard way to pull things like age and whether you have children, since that is not information that HR regularly collects or retains. You know, I think Dimitri and I and Allison and Salma have kicked around the idea of, would it be worth doing some survey-based and or more qualitative-based, right? Like I grew up with some qualitative methods from my public health days. And so I'm always interested to see, you know, the why behind the what, you know. Is this the difference of, you know, what if we looked at our faculty with children and without, and maybe that would eliminate, it's not really a gender difference, it has to do with a household difference, you know, some of those other factors. But I am curious, you know, what the driving forces are at our institution versus other institutions. Other reactions or thoughts? Susan, any kind of follow-up thoughts?
No, that's a good point, trying to get the data. And yeah, the other question was about about COVID research.
Yeah, so I would say that we were probably more limited. So Dr. Tuman and I actually did a study looking at kind of schools' ability to participate in COVID research, and we found that those projects were more concentrated in larger, well-resourced institutions. And so often smaller schools had less COVID-related research happening. And so the majority, which, I mean, I think that maybe, and Dimitri, I'd like to pivot to you in a second, you know, it might be worth going through and doing some of that research to see, is the topic of research something that changes participation? Because I don't think we drilled into like name of studies. We were looking at very, you know, kind of high level data to do some of this. But Dimitri, any thoughts on the question so far?
Anecdotally, I completely agree. Just looking through our Scopus results, there has not been a ton of COVID research out of Brody during that period. And then Cierra and I had an article recently published in Journal of Continuing Education and Health Professions that was focused on the trajectory of publications just in the Department of Pediatrics. But one of the reviewers made us go back and look, and we really didn't find very many, if any, hardly any COVID-related publications, at least through calendar year 2020. So I completely agree. It's a story that I think if you look at somewhere like Duke, where they're starting with a very high baseline already, and then they're experiencing rapid growth in publications in general. A lot of that is coming from COVID research, less so I would say here at ECU.
Thank you.
Cheryl, I see your hand raised.
Well, actually, it's I raised it because Dr. Brown had her hand up earlier. I wanted to make sure that her
Oh,
comment, it went up and then
sure.
it went down, so I didn't know. To make sure.
Oh, yes. I think
Yeah,
someone earlier asked a question that I was interested in. It was essentially about date of publication. I was just curious, being in the humanities, I know personally for myself, I had several publications come out, but it's a little misleading because they were already in the pipeline. But I think you addressed that earlier, and I forgot who asked the question, but it essentially was asking the same thing. And then another question I wanted to know is, did you all collect race demographic, and did you see any difference among race?
look at my next table. A great question. Yeah, so not significant, right? I do think in Dimitri, I'm sorry, I'll pull on you for a moment here. I see Dimitri dropped something in the chat, but we did look at race, tenure, faculty rank, specialty. So yes, Susan. I thought I saw your hand go back up. I'm sorry if not. So yeah, based on, and we've written this up, it has been submitted, but it is not published yet. And so based on our data, I don't think that we found anything statistically significant about race, and I'm going back and rereading our results at the moment. But Dimitri, feel free to jump in if that's something that I'm missing. I think the only one that stood out was Asian as compared to white had some differences, and then obviously appointment in a tenured or tenure track position, senior as compared to junior faculty, were associated with an increased number of publications, but I don't think that those stood out for our two other measures. Is that correct, Dimitri?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges here, thinking about race and ethnicity, is, with persistent underrepresentation in academic medicine, especially of Black, African American, Hispanic, Latino faculty, it's just hard to tease out what are potential inequities in scholarly activity, especially looking at a single school. So, the lack of statistical significance, I think, is it's certainly some of our data, but I don't know that that's conclusive from a national perspective.
Very well said. That's what I was trying to get at. And does that answer your question, Dr. Brown?
Yes, thank you.
Wonderful. And I've included our other tables here in case they are of interest to others. One of the things we were trying to drill down was looking at PI versus COI. And so, some of this was trying to see if, maybe there was an advancement in, leadership on a study. So, people leading as a PI versus just being as a co-investigator. And then again, kind of going back to that IRB kind of piece, there's the overall number, but then we tried to drill down to see if type of IRB submission, because, there's a little bit of a difference between running a study that would be a full board review versus expedited versus exempt. So seeing if that might have potentially been a driver of these things as well. And so, just kind of looking at all that, it was still consistent that women submitted a significantly greater number of proposals for extramural funding, and kind of similarly when we're looking at kind of the trends in IRBs, there was a decreased number of IRB submissions among women from 2019 to 2021, but that was mostly in their role as co-investor versus as PI. So, and I think there was a little bit of a difference here, as you can kind of see by the numbers of things that were requiring full board review and exempt review rather than studies that were expedited review. But just trying to understand that in the bigger context, I feel like, overall our women faculty seem to be doing rather well. So, sorry, this is the numbers for the extramural funding. One of the things that we were looking at is, kind of this uptick in industry-sponsored clinical trials. And some of that, as we were building out the discussion and talking about this more, is this, kind of the thresholds that we have to cross to do certain types of research. And so obviously, it bodes well that our faculty are submitting a lot of proposals, but is it easier for us to engage in something like an industry-sponsored clinical trial versus writing a proposal for, a request for proposals from a grant organization and those kind of things? So anybody have thoughts on extramural funding or IRB submissions outside of just publications as a measure? I'd say the last point, and really what we started going through in the discussion, and happy to share a draft of the paper with anybody who's interested in it, we really credited the success of our faculty to a lot of the programming that Brody has been working on and putting in place. And so when you look at the literature, I think we've done a great job of having things like the Brody Women Faculty Committee, MAP, which historically had been there to help provide research mentorship to women. It's now open to women and underrepresented in medicine groups. And so those kind of very purposeful programmings could be the difference of people having support at our institution, whereas, other smaller institutions don't have that. I think future research would definitely benefit from looking at this from a multi-institutional level. Again, there's lots of limitations with ours being a single site. And then to your points, looking at this in a few more years to see if there's any kind of longer term effects rather than shorter term effects that are driving these differences. I'd love to hear other thoughts from people as far as future directions for this research or ways this research could be complemented, or if anybody knows how this is fitting into some of the broader work that is being done around gender differences and scholarly activity around Brody. I'd like to pause for a moment and hear anybody else's thoughts on all of this. Yes, Cheryl.
I'd love to see a follow-up with you. You talked earlier about maybe some qualitative work later on. I would love to see, do mentorships help? You do have this really strong group of women over on the health sciences campus. And so, does that help with encouragement or, having people come together and be responsible to each other? It's like, yeah, I wrote however many. So that would be a great follow-up, I think. It's like, do those partnerships, do those mentorships help? Right.
I totally agree. I mean, I always go into, in one of us, we were trying to stay in line with kind of that early COVID research, but I do think surveys are incredibly helpful. Understanding, I mean, a lot of people feel so distant now from early pandemic, but I can tell you just experience from when I was solely in peds, it was really hard to sort through what projects were considered critical. And so I can only imagine some of the conversations that people had around, what is worth submitting to the IRB, what is worth pursuing for publication, what is worth, applying for grant-wise. And so I wonder how much of that will dissipate now that people feel more comfortable doing, the research that they're passionate about versus limiting things to just what felt like critically important research. anybody who hasn't talked want to engage or ask a question or anything you all feel like we haven't covered yet? Yes, Helen.
Yeah, thanks. I just feel kind of irrelevant because I'm also a historian like Dr. Brown, but I work in the first millennium BCE. And I was just thinking it would be really cool to be able to do some kind of qualitative survey of the actual people whose stats you tracked to find out how much of that research that was published in the time frame you guys are focusing on is actually kind of stale research. Like I know the publications that I was able to generate during the pandemic with all of my caregiving were things that I had abandoned before. So they weren't necessarily new research. They were projects that I had lying around that I thought, like, I'm desperate to make it look like I'm productive. Like, let me just try sending this out to a lesser tier journal. So sort of, I mean, if it's just interviewing those folks through a survey, that would be one way to do it, but also just sort of asking, like, when was this research actually begun, and what does that say about criticality in a sort of larger, zoomed out perspective? Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't heard the term stale research, but I do like that as a thought process because I agree. I mean, Dimitri and I are both guilty, and I'm referencing him a lot because we have routine meetings. But we'll have lists of projects, and there are the projects that have gone dead, and then they miraculously come back to life, and you're like,
yeah.
yeah, I'm like, oh yeah, this thing, you know, or I mean, and that was part of what we were trying to get at with the IRBs is, you know, did people jump over to doing exempt research, right? Like we thought we'd see the significant fall off of full IRB research because I'm like, oh, well, it would make sense if you just started submitting a bunch of like, oh, I'll do secondary data or something that's easier to round out. But I don't think the numbers specifically speak to that at the moment, but it would be interested to kind of track some of that, what drove this research versus that research. I think Soph put something in the chat. Let's see what they said. So excellent question, Soph. So I think one of the frustrating things in doing this, so Soph's question, I guess I should read it out just since this is being recorded in case people can't see it, is where do trans and non-binary researchers fit in this, if at all? Is this out of the scope? Is there not enough data on trans and non-binary research? So in that limitation section, we are limited to what HR collects. So similar to number of kids, whether you're partnered, if we don't have HR data on it, we have no way of using that as a data point. And so I think that's one of the strengths of qualitative data. You can sort out some of those other demographics that aren't necessarily captured. So no, at this point, we did not have sufficient data. And maybe Dimitri, I know you were the one who secured the HR data set, and so you're more familiar with their variables, but I don't think that we had any data on transgender, non-binary from a faculty perspective, but I could be wrong. If you recall, Dimitri, I'd be happy for you to share.
So I think as you said, the provenance of the data is what HR collected, and I don't know historically the ability to which they gave people much of a choice, right, in gender identity. So we're kind of working with HR data that might have been collected several years ago. I don't know what they collect now for new hires. I think this is a really important thing to continue looking at and calling attention to. And again, this is probably where, you know, some qualitative work might reveal more of what how those dynamics play out beyond the binary.
For sure, and I think, you know, so just from my other research or interest in LGBTQ health and LGBTQ well-being, especially in academic medicine, I think, you know, I'm always interested to add things like sexual orientation as well as gender identity to research. And so, you know, what do these other kind of aspects or, you know, the intersectionality of our lives play out in our professional careers? And so I think that there's definitely room for those sort of questions. And so it's unfortunate that this research is framed in a binary, but I think that also goes back to, you know, Dr. Human's point of needing more reform around what HR truly collects and shares. So thank you for the point. I think excellent. Other questions or comments or thoughts on this and directions we can take it? Just because she works with me, I'm going to pick on Danielle. So Danielle, if you're in a space where you can talk, I'd love to hear some of your insights or thoughts on this research. She might not be in a place where she can get on her mic. Danielle works in peds, so. Oh, of course, your microphone's working. It's like, I think I remember that from a meeting. Yeah, so, well, everyone, I really appreciate the feedback so far. Yes, sorry, I see another question. Melinda?
Yeah, I was just wondering too, if caregiving was more shared early on in the pandemic because of just all hands needing to be on deck kind of thing, kids are home. I'm wondering if because of the way we traditionally divide labor, if women were better at balancing it because they're having to balance things all the time. And that maybe for some men, if they were used to more traditional division of labor, having to work with kids in the house or other kinds of balancing acts, that might have had an impact on them in a way that it didn't for women.
Yeah, social norms are, I think, a huge factor in this, especially looking at what the other literature was alluding to, that, you know, we do tend to take these very gendered perspectives on division of labor. And so it could be very unfamiliar territory for somebody who hadn't traditionally had to take care of kids or take care of elderly parents or go through some of that balancing act that a lot of our women faculty are used to. I think that's an excellent point.
Especially early on when everyone was in one place, you know, when we all had to be in our houses and you couldn't choose to be away. Yeah.
Well, I would say one counter argument to that and where I find this interesting is that in looking at physician faculty, a lot of physician faculty still had to come on site, right? So even with changes on restrictions to research, that's where those clinical duties did tend to uptick. And so I don't know that we had the same remote work fully, you know, in the house cooped up together amongst physician faculty that you had amongst other faculty types, right? Because they had to show up to clinic and they had to keep doing these kind of activities.
And remind me, I know you talked about the various things you controlled for. Did you control for specialty?
Yeah, we looked at primary care versus specialty care as well.
Because there might be. Okay. All right.
Yeah. And I'm seeing a few comments. So we have, this is always an interesting topic for me. This raises issues about productivity across careers. Does it fluctuate more for women? I think that's definitely an interesting, thank you, Donna, for the question. I think that is definitely interesting. And you know, that was one of the things that we looked at, especially, I know, junior versus more senior ranks to see how that would impact it and tenure versus non-tenure track. But I recognize that can sometimes be very cumbersome ways of measuring kind of careers, right? But we don't have many other standard ways for measuring kind of career progression. You know, some of the things that we've also talked through is, you know, trying to recognize that when you look at, you know, kind of career advancement and those kind of things, is it's just a pressure that women are feeling already. And so, you know, the idea that we can't have a gap, right, is an interesting kind of opinion piece too, of, you know, maybe there was this breathing room that men at our institution felt like they could take that women at our institution didn't feel like they could take. And so if you know, kind of see the steady state amongst men, you were right, there wasn't any drive, whereas like maybe that is part of what our women faculty were experiencing, was this, I can't let my career have this gap. I don't want to be part of a lost generation. You know, if you're seeing these early reports about your research getting halted and that could have these long-term impacts, is that enough of a motivating factor for you to kind of push harder than some of your peers? Danielle said that they felt the same way as Melinda. I'd be interested in how social norms factored into how the researchers felt during the pandemic in terms of productivity and pressure of work productivity. I agree. I think there's definitely room. And so if others are interested, I mean, obviously, I think that's the next step is definitely survey, qualitative research, kind of investigating this more amongst our faculty. And then even looking at a world, and I dare say, and I'm knocking on wood, but in a more post-pandemic environment, you know, how do we maintain this level of productivity, or how do we continue to encourage, you know, scholarly activity in a way that people feel supported? Maybe women having more opportunity to be at home gave them that breathing room to actually work on their projects or pick up the stale studies, you know. Susan, I see your hands raised again.
Yeah, thank you. I was just thinking about teaching responsibilities and how that competed with our research time when we had to pivot and suddenly doing all of our classes online. And for some of us, it was quite time consuming. I was just curious, did the Brody faculty also have that kind of experience?
Yeah, I don't know that we had a good way to look at teaching load. So the only thing we looked at percentage of FTE, but I realize that isn't representative of whether you're clinically oriented or teaching oriented as a faculty member. Dimitri, any thoughts on whether we could get that data, or is that something we'd also have to couch within a survey?
Well, I think, you know, impact on teaching in Brody, I would defer to Dr. Egan among the folks on the call here. I don't know how much we could go back and get that information for physician faculty in a way that really reflects the differences in how much teaching they did. A lot of teaching they were doing was teaching medical students in clerkships and in AI. So during the clinical years, we have some physician faculty who are involved in the pre-clinical curriculum, but it's a bit of a different setup, is my understanding, from what we think of as kind of traditional teaching in you know, what we do in social sciences and humanities.
I'm thinking about
Yeah.
the difference between the medical faculty and other disciplines, possibly. I don't know.
Yeah, I was just going to agree with that. At the kind of what I call season one of the pandemic, when main campus was specifically dealing with a pretty extreme pivot, we did do a lot of stuff online at Brody, but at least for me personally, that's because I teach in a non-clinical course. There was still a lot more that was happening face to face. So although we did have our struggles and, you know, more time committed to an online pivot, it was not quite as significant as over on the undergraduate and graduate campus, just because so much of our work is in that clinical space. And it was kind of shorter lived as well. So I just wanted to agree with Dimitri on that point. And we also don't have the same structure for assignments of teaching. I know this just from having just submitted my pad. And so it's a little bit harder, I think, to track over at Brody than it is, because so much of the teaching is done in clinical clerkships, like you said, at the bedside, and it just looks so different.
Thank you.
Agreed. Yeah.
There are a
This has
couple
been a
of
wonderful
comments and
discussion tonight.
yeah.
Oh, yeah, sorry, let me check
I'm so
the
sorry.
chat.
Mhm.
I think I've read all the comments that I see. I don't know if there's any comments that you're getting that I don't have, but I think
There are a
Danielle's was the
couple.
last I read.
Yeah, there are a couple. Soph Myers-Kelly says, I'll check with HR. I didn't know if we had acknowledged that out loud about what they're collecting about
yeah,
COVID.
no. Yeah, thank you, Soph, for looking into that, because I mean, this goes back to we're even looking at it now for patients and how we can make sure that we have that information to be able to help and move these things forward. So I'd love to see what HR has to say about that.
Right. And the last comment from Danielle as well. I don't think we've acknowledged that one. I would be interested in
Yeah.
how social norms factored into how the researchers felt during the pandemic in terms of productivity and the pressure of work productivity. So
Yeah,
wasn't sure if we
spot
had
on, Danielle.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think those are the kind of things to incorporate in kind of a qualitative component or follow up. And we've submitted this. I'm always interested to see what reviewers have to say back, because they could look at this and, because it's a single site, not find it relevant. It could just be fascinating that we had such a different experience than the rest of the literature seems to be having. I mean, I think that speaks volumes to what Allison Flowers and others are able to do to kind of promote, closing the gender gap and creating parity amongst faculty. So, and Susan, I can't tell if this is a newly raised hand or previous, but another question?
No, sorry, I'll lower it.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, perfect. Wonderful. Any other questions or comments we can add or address or discuss as a group? Well, thank you all for the time and feedback today. I always love to, often I'm sitting around with one or two people hashing out these kind of topics, and I'd love to get kind of broader feedback and other perspectives, because, these kind of things I think are important for us to discuss and continue addressing as an institution.
Well, thank you for coming. This was really interesting, and I appreciate everybody coming to this first Gender to a T of the new year. So hope to see you again, and hope to hear more about your research as it moves along. This is great. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you all.
Mhm. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.